Welcome to the Epic Stories, a sleep channel where history drifts through the ages, guiding you into calm, reflective rest. We begin our analysis not at a point of violent rupture, but during a period of perceived stability. The true collapse of great powers rarely occurs in a single dramatic event. It is instead a process of structural fatigue, financial strain, and administrative overload. We start with the Roman Empire, specifically the transition from the age of the five good emperors into its long decline. The year is 180 CE. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, has died. The Pax Romana, an era of relative peace and prosperity, is ending. The empire is at its largest geographical extent, a breathtaking logistical achievement that now faces a critical challenge: scale itself. The maintenance of this enormous territorial integrity becomes the primary, unyielding cost. The fundamental issue facing the empire was the cost of the periphery. The limes, the vast fortifications stretching across Europe and the Near East, required a standing military force, the legions, that numbered over 300,000 men. This immense commitment was static. It was not generating new wealth through conquest, but was perpetually draining the treasury to defend what was already owned. The cost of maintaining soldiers, provisioning them across immense distances, and dealing with localized border incursions began to eclipse the revenue generated by the core provinces. This relentless financial pressure led directly to the central economic mechanism of the Roman decline: coin debasement. Gold and silver coinage, such as the denarius, was the foundation of imperial commerce and taxation. To meet payroll for the armies without raising politically volatile taxes on the elite, successive emperors found an expedient, corrosive solution: reducing the amount of precious metal in the coin and replacing it with cheap base metals like copper. Under Nero, 1st century CE, the denarius contained approximately 90% silver. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it was already down to about 75%. This process accelerated dramatically after 180 CE. The result of debasement was simple and devastating: rampant inflation. As the intrinsic value of the coin plummeted, prices for goods and services soared. Merchants refused to accept imperial currency at face value, hoarding older, more metallic coins. The state demanded taxes in silver, but paid its soldiers in debased coins, leading to continuous unrest and disloyalty within the military ranks. This financial decay was quiet, playing out over generations, yet it was arguably more destructive than any barbarian invasion. It eroded the very belief in the economic stability of the empire. Adding to the economic and logistical stress was the catastrophic demographic blow dealt by the Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE. While modern historians debate the exact casualty count, it is agreed that the population of the Mediterranean world fell significantly, possibly by 10 to 15%. This depletion resulted in two critical failures: a reduced capacity for agricultural production, leading to food scarcity, and a smaller pool of recruits for the legions. The empire had less food, fewer taxes, and fewer soldiers at the very moment its borders demanded maximum vigilance. The death of Commodus in 192 CE eliminated the last semblance of dynastic succession and ushered in a clear institutional shift: the militarization of the imperial office. The power of the Senate faded into irrelevance. The new reality was that the emperor was chosen, and routinely disposed of, by the armies. The Severan dynasty, 193 to 235 CE, founded by Septimius Severus, solidified this principle. His famous, chilling directive to his sons was to enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. This was not merely cynical advice. It was the recognition that the state budget must prioritize military pay above all else, including infrastructure, civil administration, and public welfare. The empire officially became a garrison state, where its survival was directly proportional to the immediate loyalty of its armed forces, purchased at an ever-increasing price. The final administrative error of this initial phase was the Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE. This decree extended Roman citizenship to virtually all free residents across the imperial territory. While sometimes viewed as a progressive act, its primary motivation was pragmatic and fiscal. Citizens were liable for far more inheritance and property taxes than non-citizens. The state was desperate to expand its tax base to finance the perpetually swelling military budget. The unintended consequence, however, was a subtle but profound devaluation of the Roman identity. Citizenship, once a fierce privilege, became merely a requirement for mandatory taxation. When the distinction between the rulers and the ruled becomes purely a fiscal calculation, the psychological unity necessary for a centralized empire begins to fray. By the assassination of the final Severan emperor in 235 CE, the empire was structurally ready for the crisis of the 3rd century. The seeds of collapse were not sown by external enemies, but by the empire's own unsustainable economy, demographic weakness, and the fatal elevation of military expenditure over civil governance. The vast structure was intact, but its internal mechanisms, trust, currency, and identity, were silently broken. The long, drawn-out process of administrative failure had begun. Following the assassination of Alexander Severus in 235 CE, the structural weaknesses of the Roman state became immediate, existential threats. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was not merely a downturn. It was an episode of nearly 50 years of systemic collapse, during which the empire briefly ceased to function as a unified entity. The decline accelerated rapidly from administrative fatigue into outright anarchy. The defining feature of this era was the phenomenon of the barracks emperors. Between 235 CE and 284 CE, at least 26 men were recognized as legitimate emperors, with many more attempting the title. The average reign length fell to less than 2 years. This succession mechanism was simple. An ambitious general, backed by his legion, would be proclaimed emperor. To survive, the incumbent emperor had to fight the usurper. If the usurper won, he became the new incumbent, only to face the next challenge almost immediately. This cycle ensured two things: a fatal hemorrhaging of the empire's most experienced military leadership in civil wars, and the constant redeployment of legions away from the threatened borders, moving them inward to fight Romans. The financial system, already fragile from earlier debasement, entered a state of hyperinflation. Each new emperor, needing to immediately secure the loyalty of the army that elevated him, promised massive donatives, cash bonuses. Since the treasury was perpetually empty from the last crisis, the only means to fund these payments was to further debase the silver coinage. By 265 CE, the Antoninianus coin, which was supposed to contain silver, was often less than 2% silver, essentially becoming a copper token with a thin silver wash. The state was now demanding taxes, often in kind, grain, oil, resources, because its own currency was worthless, destroying commercial trust. The currency's intrinsic value had entirely disappeared, reducing commerce to inefficient barter across vast stretches of the empire. While the Romans fought each other internally, the empire's external enemies recognized and exploited the vulnerability. Along the Danube, the Goths began major incursions, culminating in the death of Emperor Decius in battle in 251 CE, the first time a Roman emperor was killed by a foreign enemy. In the west, Germanic tribes like the Alemanni pushed deep into Italy itself. Most threateningly, in the east, the newly established and aggressive Sasanian Empire shattered Roman power, capturing Emperor Valerian himself in 260 CE. This unprecedented humiliation confirmed to all provinces that the central authority in Rome could no longer guarantee their security. The ultimate sign of the empire's systemic failure was its temporary political fragmentation. In response to the vacuum of power and the failure of Roman defense, two significant secessionist states arose. 1. The Gallic Empire, 260 to 274 CE, established in the west by Postumus, it encompassed Roman Britain, Gaul, and Hispania. It operated as a fully independent state, issuing its own currency and fielding its own legions, all while claiming to be the true Roman authority protecting the western provinces from the Germanic tribes. 2. The Palmyrene Empire, 270 to 273 CE, under the rule of Queen Zenobia. This powerful client kingdom in the east seized control of Roman Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. Palmyra was a vital trade hub, and its secession cut off Rome's supply of vital grain and resources from Egypt. For a time, the Roman world was split into three competing, hostile fragments. The empire had, for all practical purposes, dissolved into regional military states. The fragmentation was halted only by a brief and brutal resurgence of centralized authority under a series of capable generals, chief among them Aurelian, 270 to 275 CE. Known as the Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, Aurelian systematically addressed the immediate external and internal threats. He defeated the Alemanni, recovered Gaul from the Gallic Empire, and, most impressively, smashed the Palmyrene Empire, bringing the East back under Roman jurisdiction. His efforts were so rapid and forceful that they temporarily stabilized the political machine. Yet, Aurelian's reign was short, ending like many others, by assassination. However, Aurelian's actions had a lasting, symbolic impact on the nature of the decline. Recognizing that the old borders were indefensible, he took the decisive, telling step of abandoning the province of Dacia beyond the Danube. More significantly, he began the construction of the Aurelian walls around the city of Rome itself, a monumental, physical admission that the eternal city was no longer inviolable and needed protection from external threats that were now routinely breaching the northern Italian plain. By the end of the crisis in 284 CE, the empire was nominally whole again, but the foundation had shifted. The concept of the emperor as a respected figure of civil authority was dead. The bureaucracy was paralyzed by debt and decentralization. The long-term cost of 50 years of civil war, plague, and hyperinflation meant that the empire, though surviving, was a fundamentally different, scarred entity. It required a complete, authoritarian restructuring to survive the next century. The anarchy had proved that the existing imperial model was beyond salvage. The survival of the Roman Empire after the crisis of the 3rd century was a testament to its institutional inertia, but it necessitated a cure so radical that it ultimately changed the nature of the civilization it was meant to save. This restructuring was the work of two men, Diocletian and Constantine. They did not prevent the collapse. They prolonged it by replacing the decentralized, failing republic-inspired model with a rigid, centralized autocracy known as the Dominate. Diocletian, beginning in 284 CE, recognized that the empire was too vast for one man to rule and its borders too long for one army to defend. His solution was revolutionary. The Tetrarchy, rule by four. The empire was formally divided into a western and eastern half, each ruled by an Augustus, senior emperor, and a Caesar, junior emperor. This decentralization of imperial authority addressed the political chaos of the barracks emperors by ensuring simultaneous vigilance on all major fronts. However, it also cemented the east-west divide, paving the way for eventual permanent separation. To stabilize the ruined economy, Diocletian implemented pervasive state control. The coinage was briefly reformed, though the success was fleeting. Crucially, he introduced binding legislation to ensure the production of necessary goods and services. Sons were now legally obligated to follow their fathers' professions, a policy known as caste fixation. A baker's son had to be a baker, a soldier's son, a soldier. This measure was designed to prevent demographic drift and secure the tax base and military ranks, but it strangled social mobility and innovation. The citizen became a fixed instrument of the state, not a free agent. The administrative burden exploded. The number of provinces was doubled, and a new, massive bureaucracy was established to oversee the complex tax collection systems, which were increasingly based on assessing the productive capacity of the land, capitatio and jugatio, rather than simple currency collection. The army was also reorganized, split into mobile field armies, comitatenses, and static frontier guards, limitanii. The result was a state apparatus that was enormous, efficient, and astronomically expensive. The structure was saved, but at the cost of genuine liberty and sustainable finances. The reign of Constantine the Great, 306 to 337 CE, solidified these changes and introduced two critical, irreversible shifts. First, he successfully ended the tetrarchy and restored rule to a single emperor. Second, he inaugurated the process that would fundamentally shift the cultural and economic gravity of the empire toward the east. In 330 CE, Constantine dedicated his new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of Old Byzantium. Strategically positioned on the Bosphorus, it was defensible, economically vibrant, and situated near the lucrative eastern provinces, which had largely avoided the devastation of the 3rd century crisis. This move was a profound statement. The symbolic and political heart of the empire was no longer Rome. It marked the moment the resources and attention of the central government permanently favored the Greek-speaking, economically resilient East, while the Latin-speaking West became increasingly marginalized. Constantine's third and most enduring legacy was the integration of Christianity into the state structure. While Diocletian had launched the final great persecution, Constantine legalized the religion with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. By granting the Church massive endowments and tax exemptions, and by holding the Council of Nicaea, Constantine bound the fate of the imperial government to the rapidly growing religious movement. This created an internal cultural unity but also introduced a new, powerful, and sometimes fractious political player into the imperial sphere. By the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE, the process was complete. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule both the western and eastern halves. After his death, the division became permanent, with the east centered in Constantinople and the west, which included the traditional capital of Rome, governed separately. The western half was now a fragile, military-heavy state burdened by Diocletian's massive, costly bureaucracy and the ongoing fiscal strain of maintaining its military. The east, benefiting from better trade routes, denser populations, and a more secure capital, was able to finance the new dominate structure. The long decline had reached a pivotal stage. The Roman Empire had avoided immediate death, but only by transforming into an over-regulated, centralized, and economically rigid entity that prioritized state security over the vitality of its provinces. The cure, total state control, had become the disease, leaving the West brittle and unable to handle the migrations that were already gathering at the borders. With the formal, permanent split in 395 CE, the Western Roman Empire began its rapid, terminal descent. The collapse of the West was not an instantaneous crash, but the failure of an overburdened administrative structure to process repeated, overwhelming external shocks. The East, centered in Constantinople, was wealthier and more strategically defensible, and it learned to deflect threats westward. The West, relying on a depleted tax base and a series of child emperors, became the recipient of the full force of the Germanic migrations. The catalyst for this period was the destabilization of Eastern Europe caused by the Huns. Their westward movement pushed various Germanic tribes, most critically the Visigoths, against the Roman frontier. Recognizing the immense pressure, the Western Empire agreed to allow the Visigoths to settle inside the Roman borders in 376 CE as federati, or federated allies, in exchange for military service. This was a rational decision of logistics and defense, but its disastrous execution, involving corruption and starvation of the Goths, led to their immediate revolt. The revolt culminated in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where the Emperor Valens and a significant portion of the Eastern Field Army were annihilated. This defeat had two profound, irreversible consequences for the West. First, it exposed the utter vulnerability of the Roman legions to heavy barbarian cavalry. Second, and more importantly, it forced the West to rely almost entirely on increasingly large, semi-autonomous armies composed of non-Romans, led by non-Roman generals. The Roman army was no longer a national force. It was a patchwork of allied tribal contingents fighting for Roman pay. The slow, internal collapse was now visibly externalized. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself. While Rome was no longer the political capital, the psychological impact across the entire Mediterranean world was incalculable. It shattered the belief in Roman permanence. This event was not a death blow, but a massive hemorrhage of prestige and confidence. Following the sack, the Visigoths moved into Gaul and then Hispania, establishing a semi-independent Visigothic kingdom within the empire's borders. This pattern was rapidly replicated. The Vandals crossed into North Africa in 429 CE and seized the vital grain provinces, which had supplied Rome with food and taxes for centuries. This single act effectively cut the financial lifeline of the Western government. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes began settling in Britain, which the Roman government officially abandoned, acknowledging its inability to protect the distant province. The Burgundians established their own kingdom in Gaul. The Western emperor became a ghost, a mere figurehead dependent on the loyalty of one military commander, usually of Germanic origin. The true power rested in the hands of magistri militum, masters of soldiers, like Stilicho and Aetius. These men, often part German themselves, controlled the army, chose the emperors, and negotiated with other barbarian leaders. The Roman state was being administered by its supposed enemies, who were often the only figures capable of maintaining any semblance of order. The final major challenge was the return of the Huns under Attila. In the 440s, Attila demanded tribute from both East and West. The West, under the general Aetius, managed to forge a temporary, desperate coalition of Romans and various foederati, Visigoths, Franks, to stop the Huns at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE. This was often called the last major Roman victory, but it was a victory won entirely by barbarian allies on Roman soil. It did not save the empire, it merely determined which Germanic group would inherit its territory. The last flicker of imperial authority was extinguished in 476 CE. The Gothic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer did not take the title of emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia back to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer required an emperor and that he would rule Italy as a viceroy. This quiet, bureaucratic act of deposition, rather than a violent invasion, is traditionally cited as the end of the Western Roman Empire. The state did not so much fall as it ceased to exist, replaced by a mosaic of regional Germanic kingdoms that had simply taken over the functions of the Roman administration. The process of decline was complete, replaced by the long, fractured history of the early Middle Ages. The collapse of the classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands presents a profound contrast to the fate of Rome. There was no decisive battle, no barbarian king dictating terms, and no central treasury bankruptcy declared in a palace. Instead, the great cities of the Peton rainforest, Tikal, Kalakmul, Köpen, did not fall, they were silently vacated. Their decline was a protracted withdrawal, a slow abandonment driven by the unholy alliance of environmental stress and systemic political dysfunction. This decline, often termed the classic Maya collapse, began not with conquest, but with a dramatic reduction in the single most important activity of the Maya elite, stela erection. The erection of these carved stone monuments, which recorded royal history, triumphs, and the critical long count calendar dates, essentially ceased across the lowlands after 810 CE. This lack of monumental output marks the moment that the divine authority of the kings began to visibly fail, signaling a deep, paralyzing crisis of legitimacy. The core vulnerability was ecological. The Maya civilization was one of the most densely populated societies in the pre-Columbian world, supporting millions across the challenging karst landscape of the lowlands. This required an intense, ingenious manipulation of the environment, vast systems of agricultural terracing, sophisticated water management with reservoirs and canals, and heavy dependence on slash-and-burn agriculture, Sweden. This level of intensive land use, necessary to support the non-productive elite class and the colossal construction projects, put immense pressure on fragile rainforest soils. As the population peaked around 750 CE, this pressure intersected critically with climate change. Paleoclimatological data extracted from lake sediment cores and speleothems, cave formations, indicates a series of prolonged and severe droughts that struck the region between the mid-8th and early 10th centuries. These were not minor dry spells. They were multi-decade events that drastically reduced the water levels in the critical surface reservoirs which supplied the major cities. The failure of these reservoirs meant the failure of the urban system itself. The response to this strain was not effective adaptation, but political fragmentation and warfare. The ideology of the Maya elite was predicated on the divine authority of the Keuhulaja, holy lords, whose rituals, sacrifices, and calendar calculations were believed to maintain cosmic order and guarantee the rains. When the rains failed repeatedly, and the harvests withered, the ideological foundations of the kingdom crumbled. Instead of uniting, the great city-states, which had always existed in a state of tense, competitive rivalry, turned on each other with increased ferocity. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dos Pilas shows a desperate militarization. Palaces were converted into fortified strongholds, and defensive walls were hurriedly constructed. Warfare shifted from ritualistic capture for sacrifice to destructive, siege-based conflicts aimed at destroying rivals' resources and infrastructure. This internal strife further disrupted trade routes, severed food supply lines, and displaced rural populations, accelerating the ecological and agricultural collapse. The decay was manifest in the abandonment of central authority. As the king's power waned, the common people who bore the burden of taxation, labor, and warfare simply began to withdraw their support. The state structure was too heavy, too demanding, and had proven utterly incapable of solving the fundamental problems of drought and famine. The commoners did not revolt in the conventional sense. They simply voted with their feet. They stopped maintaining the reservoirs, stopped supplying the elite, and moved away from the unsustainable urban centers, retreating into decentralized, smaller, more sustainable rural settlements. The process unfolded over 2 centuries. The last dated monument in the southern lowlands is from 909 CE. This was not the end of the Maya people, but the end of the specific, highly complex classic period political system. The massive ceremonial centers, the pyramids, the ball courts, the palaces, were left standing, incomplete and untended. The jungle slowly and silently reclaimed the plazas, burying the evidence of a civilization that had collapsed not under the weight of foreign invaders, but under the internal weight of its own ecological overreach and the failure of its divine kings to deliver the rain. The silence that fell over these once thriving metropolitan regions speaks to the enduring lesson of this collapse. When complexity becomes unsustainable and leadership loses legitimacy, the population will choose retreat over participation. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the undisputed pinnacle of Islamic civilization, a beacon of science and culture ruling from Baghdad, did not perish in a single dramatic battle. Its decline was a prolonged process of decentralization, a gradual surrender of authority from the caliph to regional governors and ambitious military commanders. This slow decay was rooted in a structural weakness common to all overextended empires. The cost of control exceeded the capacity of the center to fund it. By the early 10th century, the vastness of the caliphate made direct administrative control from Baghdad impractical. The system of taxation, primarily on land and trade, was crucial but increasingly difficult to enforce. Distant governors, often appointed for their military rather than fiscal acumen, began retaining larger and larger portions of the revenue. This financial independence was the first step toward political autonomy. The most significant institutional change that hastened fragmentation was the increasing reliance on military slave soldiers, known as the Mamluks, or Ghilman in the East. These soldiers, often Turkic peoples brought from Central Asia, were originally loyal only to the caliph. However, their growing necessity, as local Arab militias proved unreliable or too expensive, gave them disproportionate political power. By the late 9th century, the Mamluk generals became the true power brokers in Baghdad, installing and deposing caliphs at will. This military dominance created a power vacuum outside the capital. As the central treasury depleted due to Mamluk salaries and corruption, powerful regional dynasties sprang up, functioning as de facto independent states while offering only token allegiance to the caliph. In North Africa, the Fatimids, a Shia dynasty, rose in the early 10th century, conquering Egypt and establishing their own rival caliphate centered in Cairo. This division shattered the political and religious unity of the Islamic world. In Persia and Transoxiana, the Buyids, or Buyid dynasty, seized power. In 945 CE, they marched on Baghdad. Crucially, the Buyids did not abolish the caliphate. Instead, they took the title of Emir al-Amara, commander of commanders, and reduced the caliph to a spiritual figurehead, stripping him of all temporal authority. The caliph remained, sitting impotently in his palace, his name still mentioned in Friday prayers, but his effective rule extended no further than the palace walls. This period, from the mid-10th century onward, is characterized by the institutionalization of financial decay. The caliphs, unable to pay their armies through direct cash payments, began to use the ikta system on a wide scale. The ikta was a form of land grant where a military commander or loyal official was given the right to collect taxes from a specific piece of land, paying his soldiers directly from those funds rather than sending revenue back to Baghdad. While this system solved the immediate problem of military payment, it fatally undermined the long-term central authority. It turned tax collectors into feudal lords, incentivized the exploitation of the peasantry, and ensured that the caliphate never again had a reliable, centralized treasury. The regions became self-sufficient, and their loyalty was negotiable. By the early 11th century, the cultural and economic vitality of the region survived. Cairo, Cordoba, and the cities of Persia flourished, but the imperial, unifying structure of the caliphate had dissolved. What remained was a collection of successor states, perpetually at war, their former unity existing only in religious and cultural terms. The caliph's legitimacy was a tool, but his power was zero. The final structural blow to the Abbasid political machine came in 1055 CE with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks, nomadic Sunni Turks, were invited into Baghdad to expel the Shia Buyids. They succeeded, but then simply took the Buyids' place. The Seljuk leader took the title of Sultan, meaning authority, ruling in the caliph's name but exercising absolute secular power. The caliphate had officially been reduced to a vassal state under the control of a foreign, Turkish sultanate. The political empire, in terms of sovereign administrative control, was effectively over 5 decades before the arrival of the Mongols. The history of the Qing Dynasty's slow decay is a definitive study in institutional inertia. Unlike the Roman Empire, which fractured under external and military strain, the Qing collapse stemmed primarily from an internal inability to adapt, compounded by a spiritual exhaustion of its governing class. The peak of the empire, often cited during the reign of Qianlong in the mid-18th century, masked deep-seated, systemic problems that began to surface immediately after 1790 CE. At the core of this failure was the Grand Canal and the Yellow River. These vital arteries, which supplied grain to the capital and sustained the fiscal health of the empire, became increasingly neglected. Inadequate maintenance led to frequent, catastrophic flooding. These ecological disasters displaced millions of farmers, ruined local economies, and necessitated massive, corruption-riddled relief efforts. The inability of the central administration to manage basic infrastructure effectively became the first public sign that the mandate of heaven was weakening. Simultaneously, the administration suffered from profound corruption. The wealth generated by the empire's vast population flowed into the hands of local officials and powerful families rather than the central treasury. The salt tax, a crucial source of state revenue, became notoriously compromised. As officials skimmed profits, the government was left with hollowed-out coffers at the exact moment it needed resources for flood control, famine relief, and, critically, military modernization. This internal rot reduced the actual tax base, making the empire functionally poorer even as the gentry became individually richer. The external pressures that arrived in the early 19th century, starting with the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842, were not the cause of the decline but a catalyst that exposed the deep-seated decay. The humiliating defeats demonstrated that the Qing's traditional military and naval structures, based on antiquated methods, were no match for modern European firepower. These defeats forced the signing of unequal treaties, which granted foreign powers control over key coastal ports, tariffs, and judicial extraterritoriality. This was a critical loss of sovereignty. It was not a sudden military defeat, but a gradual, legal dismantling of China's economic independence. The dynasty's intellectual and bureaucratic response was tragically inadequate. The ruling class was rigidly committed to Confucian orthodoxy and the traditional civil service examination system, which tested classical knowledge rather than practical administration, science, or military strategy. Efforts at reform, known as the self-strengthening movement, were too localized, too late, and often undermined by conservative elements who viewed Western science as an existential threat to Chinese culture. These reformers attempted to purchase modern ships and weapons but failed to implement the necessary institutional and educational reforms to operate or maintain them effectively. The defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, was the final, devastating proof that surface-level technological fixes could not compensate for deep institutional ossification. This era was defined by internal uprisings that dwarfed the cost of any foreign war. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, alone, a civil war rooted in poverty, religious fervor, and disillusionment with the Qing, claimed millions of lives and required regional governors to raise their own private armies. The very act of suppressing the rebellion necessitated decentralizing military power, handing unprecedented authority to provincial leaders who would later become the core of the warlord era. This was the true, slow death of central authority. The necessity of empowering regional figures to save the dynasty ultimately sealed its fate by fragmenting its power base. The failure of the Qing dynasty was thus one of political imagination and bureaucratic integrity. It entered the 19th century as a vast, rich, and powerful empire, but its leaders were paralyzed by a fear of change and a commitment to archaic, dysfunctional systems. The slow, century-long process of decline was characterized by fiscal depletion, environmental neglect, foreign economic penetration, and the fatal, gradual devolution of military authority to the provinces. By 1895, the empire still stood, but its capacity to act as a unified modern state had already been utterly extinguished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, established formally in 1867 CE, provides a unique case study in imperial collapse driven by sociological friction and constitutional rigidity. This was an empire that did not succumb to external conquest in its final form, but slowly dissolved under the pressure of its own internal demographic complexity. Its decline was a process of political calcification, where every necessary action was blocked by competing ethnic interests, leading to a profound administrative paralysis. The core problem was the Ausgleich Compromise of 1867. This agreement created the dual monarchy, effectively splitting the vast territory into two autonomous halves, the Austrian Empire, Cisleithania, and the Kingdom of Hungary, Transleithania, joined only by the shared monarch, Emperor Franz Joseph, foreign policy, and the military. While this compromise solved the immediate challenge posed by Hungarian nationalism, it instantly created a structural impediment to governance across the entire realm. It was, in effect, two empires attempting to steer the same ship with separate rudders. This duality immediately rendered modernization efforts cumbersome. Economic policy, taxation, and military spending were subject to constant, grueling negotiations between the parliaments in Vienna and Budapest. Decisions that should have been swift were delayed for years by legislative deadlock, leaving the empire perpetually lagging behind industrial rivals like Germany. The slow pace of infrastructure development, particularly railway expansion and industrial regulation, was a direct consequence of this mandatory bureaucratic inertia. The most corrosive element, however, was nationalism. The 1867 compromise placated the Germans and the Magyars, but it ignored the aspirations of the Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians who collectively made up the majority of the empire's population. These excluded groups increasingly demanded self-rule or, at a minimum, equal recognition of their language and culture in schools, courts, and civil service. The political system, instead of integrating these groups, only deepened the resentments. This dynamic manifested in the Austrian parliament, Reichsrat, becoming a theater of obstruction. Czech, Polish, and South Slav delegates used parliamentary rules, notably filibusters, to intentionally render government impossible until their demands for linguistic or political equality were met. Debates devolved into shouting matches, and essential legislation, from social reform to defense spending, could not be passed. For long periods, the empire was governed only by emergency decree issued by the emperor, a clear sign that the constitutional government had ceased to function. The military, traditionally a unifying institution, also suffered from this linguistic strife. Officers were required to use German as the language of command, yet the ranks comprised conscripts speaking dozens of mutually unintelligible languages. Simple logistics, communication in the field, and even maintaining morale became unnecessarily complex and inefficient, a quiet structural vulnerability that would prove catastrophic in wartime. The army remained loyal to the emperor, but its functional efficiency was compromised by the very diversity it was meant to defend. Economically, the empire was trapped in a dichotomy. The Austrian half saw moderate industrial growth, but the Hungarian half remained largely agricultural, a disparity that fueled ongoing economic friction and resentment. The inability to establish a unified and equitable economic policy meant that pockets of extreme poverty persisted, particularly in Galicia and the Balkans, breeding further political radicalism. The government could not effectively tax the wealth centers nor adequately support the impoverished peripheries. By the turn of the century, the empire had become a museum of peoples, beautiful in its complexity, but impossible to govern. Every attempt to grant limited autonomy to one group immediately triggered intense, often violent, resistance from their ethnic rivals, fearing a loss of their own relative power. Franz Joseph, the central figure, became the only effective constitutional bridge, but his sheer longevity was merely postponing the inevitable. The internal structure was so ossified and brittle that it required only a final external shock, the assassination at Sarajevo, to shatter the entire framework, revealing that the empire had already been politically dead for decades. The final collapse was not a war loss, it was the formal recognition of a long-term institutional failure. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, referred to by European diplomats as the sick man of Europe, was characterized by a slow, agonizing hemorrhage of economic sovereignty. This was a multi-generational process where the empire's financial integrity was systematically dismantled by internal mismanagement and external, predatory lending. The final military defeats were merely the final acts of a tragedy written decades earlier in ledgers and treaties. The critical turning point was the Tanzimat reforms, starting around 1839 CE. While intended to modernize the empire along European lines, creating centralized bureaucracy, reforming the military, and standardizing law, these ambitious projects were ruinously expensive. Lacking a modernized tax base capable of funding these changes, the sultans turned to European financial markets. This began a cycle of dependency that would prove fatal. Initially, borrowing was viewed as a sign of progress, but the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, escalated this debt exponentially. Subsequent loans were secured at increasingly disadvantageous terms, often through complex financial maneuvers by Parisian and London banking houses. By the 1870s, the empire was trapped in a financial labyrinth. It borrowed money not for investment, but merely to service the interest on prior loans. The consequence was inevitable: bankruptcy. In 1875 CE, the Ottoman Empire defaulted on its loans, signaling the absolute loss of fiscal independence. The response from the European creditors was the creation, in 1881 CE, of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. This body, staffed by European representatives, was given direct control over vast swaths of Ottoman state revenue, including income from the salt and tobacco monopolies, fisheries, and excise taxes. The OPDA acted as a state within a state. It bypassed the Ottoman bureaucracy, collected taxes directly from citizens, and ensured that this revenue went straight to European bondholders before a single cent could fund the Sultan's government. At its peak, the OPDA managed revenues that rivaled the income of several European countries and employed thousands of personnel, demonstrating a complete capitulation of economic control. The empire was still technically sovereign, but its domestic fiscal policy was dictated from London and Paris. This loss of financial authority had immediate repercussions on the military and administration. With a significant portion of tax income diverted to foreign creditors, the Ottoman government could not afford to modernize its army, reform its bureaucracy, or invest in education and infrastructure at the pace required to compete with Europe. This financial weakness fueled the political instability, as the military, chronically underfunded and technologically inferior, grew increasingly frustrated and politically active. Furthermore, the empire was undermined by the capitulations. These were a series of treaties granted originally to friendly European powers, exempting their citizens and merchants from local Ottoman law and taxation. These privileges, which once encouraged trade, were exploited mercilessly in the 19th century. European merchants enjoyed enormous advantages over Ottoman subjects, choking local industry and allowing foreign powers to dominate the empire's internal markets. This created a profound sense of injustice and economic exploitation among the Ottoman elite and its nascent merchant class. The cumulative effect of the OPDA and the capitulations was the creation of a semi-colonial economic structure. The empire was not formally annexed, but its economic independence was nullified. When the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 CE attempted to restore constitutional rule and revitalize the empire, they inherited a state that was fiscally crippled and geographically shrunk by decades of lost wars and nationalist secessions. The final act of imperial collapse during World War I merely formalized the economic and administrative decline that had been systematically engineered by debt and institutional failure over the preceding century. The journey through these collapsing empires, from the Roman limes to the Yellow River, reveals a consistent truth. Empires do not typically die from a single traumatic blow, but from a persistent, low-grade fever that attacks their core institutional functions. The dramatic end, the fall of Constantinople, the abdication of a monarch, the arrival of foreign troops, is merely the point where the decades or centuries of internal structural decay become impossible to ignore. The great lesson of slow collapse is that the most dangerous enemies are often internal, administrative, and economic. We find the first common thread in fiscal erosion. In every case, the central government loses its ability to collect taxes efficiently and maintain a stable currency. The Roman crisis of the 3rd century was defined by hyperinflation and debasement, making state planning impossible. Similarly, the late Qing Dynasty's true decline was marked by corrupt officials redirecting the salt tax, leaving the central treasury bankrupt. The Ottoman Empire's control was entirely subverted by the European-controlled public debt administration after its 1875 default. In each instance, the power to govern began to decay the moment the power to pay was outsourced or corrupted. The second shared characteristic is institutional rigidity. Great empires often become victims of their own past successes, clinging to structures that were brilliant in one era but are obsolete in the next. The Qing Dynasty's commitment to its classical Confucian examination system prevented it from generating the engineers and strategists needed to counter Western power. The Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy was so committed to balancing Magyar and German interests that its constitutional framework became an engine of administrative paralysis, where no major reform could ever pass. This intellectual and bureaucratic inflexibility acts like calcification on the arteries of the state, preventing the adaptation necessary for survival. The third thread is the tyranny of the periphery and the decay of central authority. As the central treasury weakened and its institutions became unresponsive, the peripheries inevitably gained power. For Rome, this manifested in the rise of the barracks emperors and the necessity of handing military command to federati, barbarian allies, who then controlled the fate of the West. In the Abbasid Caliphate, the inability of Baghdad to project power resulted in the rise of powerful, autonomous regional dynasties like the Buyids and Seljuks. The necessary decentralization to manage internal revolts in the Qing led directly to the eventual fragmentation by warlords. The empire becomes an empty shell, nominally controlled by the center but actively governed by strongmen or local interest groups. The most tragic form of slow collapse, seen most clearly in the Maya Classic period, is the socio-environmental fracture. This form is less about foreign conquest and more about ecological stress amplified by centralized hierarchy. When the agricultural base, strained by drought, deforestation, or overpopulation, can no longer support the massive, top-heavy elite structure, the people simply stop participating in the state's rituals. The great cities are not sacked, they are simply vacated, their monuments left unfinished, as the population disperses back into manageable, sustainable units, abandoning the unsustainable complexity of empire. Ultimately, the fall of empires is the history of neglected maintenance. They fail to maintain the fiscal discipline, the institutional flexibility, and the necessary infrastructure, be it roads, irrigation, or a unified purpose that once bound them together. The decline is not the result of a single flaw, but of 1,000 small compromises, a corrupt tax collector here, a delayed infrastructure bill there, an unaddressed ethnic grievance everywhere. When the final external challenge arrives, the empire appears to shatter instantly, yet the truth is far more quiet and insidious. The foundations had long ago been removed, one piece at a time, leaving only an impressive facade waiting for the final, gentle push.